Comédie Française in Paris as Georges Sand Gabrielle featuring in the theatre. Hopefully this will become as recurrent as the Procès de Bobigny. This is a dramatisation of a trial where the lawyer and the mother become French heroines in the best sense of the word. Before, during and after the trial of Procès de Bobigny, French women were demanding change. In 1972, the nation watched on their black and white televisions with bated breath the trial of a teenage girl, Marie-Claire Chevalier, unfolding. With the help of her mother, she obtained an abortion after she was raped by a schoolmate. When she was acquitted in a country where for a brief period abortion had been punishable by death, they became much heralded. The National Theatre, Comédie Française, focuses often on the classics and an important mind former for the nation. Outside the law, hors de la loi. 1974, though, not up to the minute cutting edge, is it? Georges Sand's Gabrielle play is a fantasy set in the Middle Ages about a prince who raises his granddaughter as a boy in order to prevent his grandson, the child of his black sheep, younger son, from inheriting the kingdom. The young woman is taught to have nothing but contempt for powerless women and be grateful that she, a man, has all the privileges of manhood. When her grandfather reveals the truth to her at age 17, she vows revenge. Now, Georges Sand is a female novelist, though many people didn't realise this at the turn of the century. 200 years ago, not exactly cutting edge, when Georges Sand was completely rejecting the sex roles and mores of her society and class, she understood a nuanced and thought-provoking examination of the traps set for women and girls throughout their lives. Presumably, we're supposed to understand that a person could reach the age of 17 without knowing the difference between male and female parts of their own person. But the heroine in her heart, she knows that a woman has more to offer than she's been taught. The values of male education in the classics and logic. Her conflict is that of every woman, not a particular letter of L, G, B, T or Q. The Comédie Française wants to get on the right side of history, but offers conflicting messages in order to get one of them right. But France does have a history of offering women artists more respect and more opportunities than many other countries. The Julian Academy in Paris particularly. Rosa Bonheur of the Musée d'Orsay exhibition recently. Bertha Morisot and Mary Cassatt were treated as equals by male contemporaries. Degas and Toulouse-Lautrec encouraging their muse, their model. Suzanne Valadon says more about her than it does about them. But Frida Kahlo isn't around to stand up for herself, defend herself. Perhaps she's being described as non-binary and trans. It's an ideology, a religion almost, that can get quite evangelical, we've seen in England. But France is more conservative and slow-moving in these things, and it might just act as a balance. Femmages is a real French word. It's like a homage. Women who are infamous, scandalous, or even unknown, famous, or heroines can have femmages to them. A balance I'm talking about is when it comes to gender affirming of children. Evangelical trans putting words in children's mouths through social media so that they are like them. They're not a minority, but gender affirming approach may not be in the best interests of vulnerable children and adults. Some procedures are irreversible, and it's been suggested by quite a lot of people that the period of psychological treatment without puberty blockers or wrong sex hormones or surgeries should be extended as long as possible. France still has problems with being able to allow women to object to domestic violence. Femmes and TERFs, cis-TERFs. This is an egregious insult to women. Perhaps, for the first time in the world, a man has been allowed to describe himself as a mother on his child's French birth certificate. You may have heard of Antifa in America. This is a victimised, very loose left-wing group that are anti-fascist and anti-racist. Well, France now has a very right-wing government. If you've ever been to a football sporting event at Paris Saint-Germain Stadium or a tennis spectacle at Roland Garros Stadium for a French fairly left-wing competitor that was trying to be adopted by the Paris Saint-Germain ultras supporters. They were jumping up and down from the chest to a Nazi-style salute, bouncing like it was a rave. They were bowing and chanting his name, trying to convert him through his vanity to their way of thinking. He wasn't having any of it. But the only real successful football team in France that does represent the whole of Paris has these factions. And while it doesn't stem from the football so much, it is prevalent on the streets and in the parliament. These very disparate factional groups. But sex and identity, certainly sexuality, tends to transcend these factions. There's a cost of living crisis in France as well, and people are getting a little more hostile. But London really is the centre for open-minded lgbtq, mainly trans, thinking people from all over the world gravitate to London. It's a pull factor for illegal immigration. An acquaintance of mine doesn't go to clubs anymore of any particular orientation. Many of those clubs don't feel safe to exist even in Paris, but Paris is a much smaller city than London. There isn't the only gay in the village mentality in many small rural places, and everywhere outside of Paris is fairly small and rural. 100,000 people in a town is quite unusual. Lyon isn't known for its trans-friendliness, and Provence even less so. Quietly, a macho culture in France is still quite prevalent, but there is a denunciation of patriarchy under the sheets. Le Monde, the paper, has lost all neutrality on is pro-transgender. But those people that don't have right-wing thinking these days are living in a sort of fear of a social death penalty. Social media algorithmic bubbles only serve to confirm people's ideological biases. France, the culture of debate, is disappearing. Young people are just deciding to keep quiet, a self-censorship. Trans are a very vocal minority. There is a body of thinking that identifying oneself in someone else's demographic should not be a right, invading women's spaces and erasing the existence of women as a specific group in legislation should not be a right, imposing the metaphysical of gender identity. Sort of suicide blackmails are disingenuous. Being a woman is a biological reality in a world that's perhaps tending towards transhumanism and macho gender stereotyping. It's an extremism on all sides that's the result of these social media bubble biases, metadata feeds, positive discrimination to alleviate the biases, and the right to asylum. Exposure often fights discrimination. Trying to increase people's tolerance of difference should not mean denying the reality of sexuality and forcibly replacing it with the vague notion of gender identity for everyone. Conspiracy and fake news labels disqualify even being informed for a debate. There, of course, is always a nostalgia for douce France, pays de mon enfance, sweet France, land of my childhood. A switch to the right happens with self-censorship and the invisible creep of internet bubble rabbit holes that people vanish down. You might think of it as a political thing, but it's not, it's a religion. Really, and it's people. People tend to have children, and they influence them. Social media bubbles influence children, and even more so teenagers are now under the influence of a set of beliefs that lead to mental destabilisation, a rupture with the family if it does not support the child, and with all those who refuse to share this point of view. This ideology grip generates an antisocial and accusatory rhetoric, a specific language or even a newspeak imposed on everyone around them. The language of these young people is often scripted as if they had lost all critical thinking, which is a characteristic of the grip. You may here be confused if I'm talking about the far right or the transgender agenda, but they both use the same evangelical scripting through social media bubble feeds. Adults can make the choice about themselves. They can have a body-changing operation and reverse it at a later date when they change their mind. Breast implants, they have to be replaced every decade or so anyway, don't they? An acquaintance, an intelligent person, made the choice to keep their genitalia, but enhance themselves with breasts. They've since further enhanced themselves with lots of weight. This is partly because of the side effect of a few prescription drugs and the HRT type treatments to help feminise them further. But also, she doesn't go out to clubs anymore, no more heaven. She's got a dating profile that does all the work for her. Perhaps 3 different visitors per night, most nights of the week, and certainly at weekends. It's not a debt problem, there's no coercive control involved. She does love handbags. But basically it's an easy and dismissible way to get the attention that she craves. She used to get this attention from men as a young gay man. She was popular then, as a he. But now she's got more, once the law of diminishing returns started happening with age. Trans is part of this. It can be a conscious decision to get yourself more attention. That's fine in adults, but what about when it comes to children? Children are beings in construction themselves, constantly changing before they reach maturity. Neuroscientists, developmentalists, psychoanalysts and child psychiatrists, paediatricians, all specialists in early childhood are unanimous on the subject. Rights of self-determination can be a progress conducive to human fulfilment, but the phenomenon of the transgender child is a reality, a contemporary deceit that must be vigorously denounced. So many professionals have written an open letter saying, because it's due to ideological indoctrination. It's a stolen childhood. Some would like us to believe that in the name of the well-being and freedom of each person, a child, freed from the oversight of his reactionary parents, would be able to choose his so-called gender identity. Really, children aren't of the sufficient mental capacity, legally, to make their own decisions. Should we denounce the abduction of childhood as the worst type of trans traditional Q? Q is for queer. An open letter of professionals says it's urgent to inform the greatest number of citizens of all professions, of all allegiances, of all ages, about what could be tomorrow one of the greatest health and ethical scandals that we have watched happen without saying a word. The commodification of children's bodies, because by persuading children that they have been assigned a sex at birth and they can freely change it whenever they see fit, the same as changing a sexuality every day or with every kiss. We make them lifelong patients, lifelong customers of hormonal chemicals marketed by pharmaceutical companies, recurrent consumers of more and more surgeries in the pursuit of their chimerial dream of a fantastic body. Currently, countries that are in favour of medical transition before the age of majority now prohibit hormonal treatments for minors, but that is greeted by emotional blackmail. Young adults left in their loneliness and threatened if they speak publicly and declare that they've been pressured by the trans community when they've expressed doubts or detransitioned. Such dogmatism that they've been subjected to causes great confusion, generated by the people that they've orientated themselves towards as who will listen to them in their hour of discovery, of complexity, and best preparing for what the future might bring. But the surgery isn't a panacea for their malaise. These are French 50 medical professionals that have written this open letter, which is no mean feat to get 50 professionals to agree on wording of any document. Hate crime, well, that's another thing entirely. Honour killing, well, not killing, but it's almost like an honour issue. Without telling your parents in Scotland, a primary school child can change their name and their sex. Children are led to believe that a girl can become a boy and vice versa because they have decided to do so without the advice of adults. And this is at an increasingly young age. Unless you've got a brother or you've got a sister. Are you really going to know what you are to compare anything to? Diffusion of the trans religion beliefs has resulted in considerable inflation of requests for sex reassignment among children, and more particularly amongst adolescent girls. 10 years ago in Paris, there were 10 requests a year. 2020 comes round and it's 10 requests a month. And that's only central Paris. or the Ile-de-France. Can we do without biological reality, the sexual differences between men and women in favour of chosen characteristics based solely on feelings? These found nothing more than feelings. These unfounded claims are transmitted via social media networks where teenagers in search of identity come to look for solutions to their malaise in the name of self-determination, a slogan that appeals to all progressives. I am free to choose the body I want. Children and teenagers are convinced that they can change their sex with the help of hormonal treatments or even mutilating surgery. This rhetoric, spread by activists in many Western countries, sophisticated phraseology and grammar, designed to deceive. Such sophistries to the vulnerable is nothing more than evangelical propaganda, but shouldn't be countered by violence and intimidation of the far right and their heinous agenda.